The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, and by the time I hung up, my marriage was already over. I just didn't know it yet. Don't tell your husband. The voice said, Come alone. I stood in my own kitchen, unwrapping wedding china, staring through the doorway at the two people I trusted most in this world. My husband, his mother, laughing softly in my living room, like nothing in the world was wrong. 7 days. That's how long we'd lived in this house. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 40 years old. And a week earlier, I had closed on the home of my dreams, a 2-story colonial, a wraparound porch, a garden bed I'd already mapped out in my head for tomatoes and hydrangeas. I paid for most of it myself, an inheritance from my father, 30 years of teaching high school chemistry. And he left me enough to build something permanent. I thought I'd built a life. I didn't know I was about to lose it. The man on the phone wasn't a stranger with bad intentions. He was the man who sold me this house, and what he needed to show me would change everything I believed about the people standing in my living room. 7 days earlier, I stood in the driveway with the keys in my hand, and I remember thinking that my father would have been proud of me. The house was a 2-story colonial on a quiet street lined with old oak trees, the kind of trees that take 50 years to grow into themselves. White trim, a wraparound porch, black shutters that needed a coat of paint but nothing that couldn't wait. There was a garden bed along the side yard, overgrown but salvageable. And I had already decided, standing there with the moving truck idling behind me, that I would fill it with tomatoes in the spring, hydrangeas along the fence line, maybe a small herb garden near the kitchen door, so I could step outside barefoot in the summer and cut fresh basil for dinner. It was the kind of house you dream about when you're young and don't yet understand how much dreams cost. I was 40 years old, and this was the first thing I had ever built that felt permanent. My father had been a high school chemistry teacher for 30 years. He wasn't a wealthy man, teachers rarely are, but he was careful and disciplined. And he never once complained about the modest life that discipline gave him. He used to tell me that the surest way to lose something valuable wasn't theft. It was trust, handed to the wrong person, without ever checking where it landed. I didn't understand what he meant back then. I was still young enough to think warnings like that belonged to other people's lives. When he passed, he left me an inheritance, not a fortune, but enough that when Nathan and I found this house, I was the one who covered nearly 70% of the down payment without a second thought. It felt right. It felt like my father's careful, quiet life was reaching forward to build something for me. Something he never got the chance to have for himself. Nathan carried boxes in from the truck, humming some song I didn't recognize. Sleeves rolled up, sweat at his collar. 12 years we'd been married. 12 years since he walked into my life, at exactly the moment I needed someone to walk into it, right after my father's funeral. Right when grief had made me soft enough to let someone new all the way in. He had a way of showing up at exactly the right moments. I used to think that was romance. His mother, Margaret, arrived that first afternoon with a casserole dish and opinions about where the couch should go. She was 71. Sharp as a blade under a cardigan, the kind of woman who had never once, in her entire life, doubted her own judgment. She walked through the rooms of my new house, running her fingers along the windowsills, murmuring about flow and natural light. And I remember feeling grateful that Nathan had a mother who cared enough to help us settle in. I didn't know yet that gratitude was the first mistake. By the end of that first week, boxes still lined the hallway, and the smell of fresh paint hadn't faded from the guest room. I stood in the kitchen unwrapping a set of wedding china that had belonged to my grandmother, setting each plate carefully into the cabinet, thinking genuinely, thinking that I had finally arrived somewhere, a home, a husband, a mother-in-law who, if a little overbearing, clearly loved her son enough to want the best for him, for us. Nathan was in the living room hanging a framed photograph of his parents on their wedding day while Margaret directed him from the doorway. "A little to the left," she said, and he adjusted it without complaint, the way he always did with her. They laughed about something, some small joke I hadn't caught. I watched them for a moment through the doorway, a plate still in my hands, and felt nothing but the quiet, ordinary happiness of a woman who believed she had built something that would last. That was the Tuesday afternoon. Everything changed, because that was the exact moment my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Mrs. Carter, this is Walter Hayes. I sold you the house." I recognized the name instantly, even before my mind fully caught up with the voice. Walter Hayes, the soft-spoken man in his 70s who had handed me the keys 3 weeks earlier at the closing table. A retired electrical engineer. Kind eyes. A slight tremor in his hands when he shook mine. He'd lived in that house for 31 years with his late wife. And when the sale was finalized, he told me he hoped it would treat me as well as it had treated them. "Mr. Hayes," I said, stepping away from the kitchen doorway, lowering my voice without quite knowing why. "Is everything all right?" There was a pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I need to apologize for something," he finally said. "Years ago, we set up a smart home security system. Cameras, mostly for my wife's peace of mind when I traveled for work. I disconnected all of them before the sale, or I thought I did." My stomach tightened, though I couldn't have told you why. "I missed one," he continued. "Behind the bookshelf in the living room. It's still linked to my cloud account. I only found out because I got a notification a few days ago that my storage was full. I went to delete the footage. And he stopped again. "Mrs. Carter, I think you need to see this yourself. See what I'd rather not say over the phone. I saved everything to a drive. Please come see me." "Of course, I can bring Nathan by this alone," he said, and something in his voice shifted. Careful, almost protective. "Don't say anything to your husband yet. Please. Come alone." I told him I would, and I hung up before I could ask anything else, because my hands had started to shake, and I didn't want him to hear it in my voice. I set the phone down on the counter and looked through the doorway into the living room, where Nathan was still adjusting the framed photograph, and Margaret was still directing him with that same calm authority. And for a moment, I just watched them, searching their faces for some crack, some sign of whatever Walter Hayes thought I needed to see. There was nothing, just my husband and his mother, laughing softly, hanging a photo in a house that still smelled like fresh paint. Nathan turned and caught my eye. He smiled that same easy smile that had undone me 12 years ago, back when I was still grieving my father and desperate for someone steady to hold on to. "You look pale," he said. "I'm fine, just tired." The lie came smooth and immediate, and it frightened me a little how easily it arrived. "I think I'm going to run out for a bit. We're low on paint for the guest room." Margaret glanced at me. Her eyes lingered half a second too long the way they sometimes did, as if she were quietly measuring me against some standard I would never quite meet. "Take your time, dear," she said. "We'll finish up here." I grabbed my keys and walked out to the car, and I sat behind the wheel for a full minute before I could make myself turn the key. I told myself it was nothing, a misunderstanding. Maybe Walter Hayes had simply seen Nathan and Margaret moving furniture, measuring for curtains, doing any of the 100 mundane things people do when they're settling into a new home. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation, because that was easier than the alternative, but some part of me already knew. The way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually turns the small hesitations I'd never let myself examine too closely. The way Nathan sometimes paused before answering certain questions. The way Margaret had insisted on being present for the final walkthrough, as if the house were already partly hers. the way both of them had grown a little too comfortable, a little too fast, in a home that my father's money was quietly holding up from underneath. I pulled out of the driveway and looked once in the rear-view mirror. The house glowed gold in the late afternoon light, looking exactly like the future I had planned for myself. I didn't know yet that I was driving toward the moment that would end my marriage. I only knew that whatever waited for me at Walter Hayes's front door, I needed to see it with my own eyes. Walter Hayes's new place was a small rental on the other side of town, the kind of tidy, quiet house that belongs to a man who has spent his whole life being careful. He opened the door before I even knocked, as though he'd been watching for my car. And the look on his face told me this wasn't going to be the misunderstanding I'd hoped for on the drive over. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you would. You made it sound important." "It is." He led me to a small kitchen table where a laptop was already open, the screen dark. "Waiting. Please. Sit." I sat, and I noticed my hands were cold despite the warm afternoon, and I folded them together in my lap because I didn't want him to see them trembling. Walter lowered himself into the chair across from me with the careful movements of a man whose knees had given him trouble for years. And he was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "I want you to understand something first," he said. "I'm not a man who goes looking for other people's business. I built that camera system myself, years ago, mostly for my wife's peace of mind when I traveled for work. When we sold the house, I disconnected every camera I could remember. I missed one, the one behind the bookshelf, wired into an outlet I'd forgotten even existed. I only found out it was still active because my cloud storage sent a notification that it was full." He paused. "I went to delete the footage, and then I watched it, and I couldn't, in good conscience, delete it without showing you first." "Show me," I said, because I couldn't bear the waiting anymore. He turned the laptop toward me and pressed play. The footage was time-stamped from 4 days earlier, a Friday afternoon when I'd been at the office, finishing a project that had kept me late into the evening. The angle was slightly elevated, looking down over the living room, my living room, still half-furnished. Boxes stacked along one wall. I watched Nathan let himself in through the front door. A moment later, Margaret followed him inside, glancing around the room the way a person looks at something they're already picturing as their own. "She still thinks this house belongs to both of you," Margaret said on the recording, settling onto the arm of the sofa, her voice carrying that particular blend of warmth and steel I'd heard my entire marriage. "Sweet girl. She never even reads the fine print." Nathan laughed an easy, familiar laugh, the same one I'd fallen in love with 12 years ago. "She trusts me. Why would she read the fine print? I'm her husband. That trust is useful," Margaret said, "as long as we use it correctly." Something cold settled into my chest, a stillness that didn't yet have a name. They kept talking. Margaret mentioned a refinance package. She'd already been in contact with a broker she knew personally, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Nathan mentioned that my father's inheritance had covered nearly 70% of the down payment, and Margaret said it was a shame money like that hadn't gone through proper family channels. They talked about paperwork, about a power of attorney clause buried somewhere in a stack of documents, one that would let ownership shift gradually, quietly, legally, without ever requiring a single dramatic confrontation. Margaret said the words over time more than once, savoring them, the way you might a recipe that needed patience to come together properly. "She won't notice," Nathan said. "She never notices these things. She trusts me with all of it." I sat frozen at Walter's kitchen table, watching my husband describe my blind trust as a resource to be managed. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the man who had held my hand at my father's funeral and the man on that screen were somehow, impossibly, the same person. The video ran another 6 minutes. I watched all of it. I watched Margaret walk through my kitchen, opening cabinets, commenting that the layout would suit proper entertaining once a few walls came down. I watched Nathan nod along to every suggestion agreeable in the particular way. He'd always been agreeable with his mother, a habit I had once found endearing, because I thought it spoke of loyalty, of love. I understood now that it spoke of something else. Obedience. Maybe. Oh, alliance. When the footage ended, Walter closed the laptop gently, as though closing it too fast might hurt me further. I copied everything onto a drive, he said, sliding a small USB stick across the table toward me. Every angle, every date, everything the camera caught. He looked at me, and something in his expression softened. I don't know what's going on in your marriage, Mrs. Carter, and it isn't my place to guess. But a house holds people accountable to nothing except what's documented. I thought you should have this before anyone decides to erase what actually happened inside those walls. I picked up the drive and held it in my palm. Small, light, barely the weight of a house key, and yet it felt like it might tip the entire foundation of my life. Thank you, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I don't know how to repay this. You don't owe me anything. Walter said, I sold that house because my wife and I made a home in it. And I'd hate to think of someone taking that same chance away from another family through a lie. He walked me to the door, and just before I stepped out into the fading light, he said one more thing, quietly, almost like a warning. You still have time, Mrs. Carter. Whatever you decide to do, you still have time to do it right. I drove home with the USB drive tucked into my coat pocket, my hand resting over it at every red light, as though it might disappear if I let go. And somewhere on that quiet drive back to the house I had paid for with my father's memory, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly how deep this went, and exactly how to make sure it could never happen to me, or to anyone else. Again, I walked back into my own house that evening and became someone else. Not a different woman. Exactly. Just a quieter version of myself. One who had learned, in the space of a single afternoon, that the safest place to keep the truth was behind a closed door in my own chest. How was the paint store? Nathan asked, not even looking up from the box of kitchen utensils he was unpacking. Bozy, I said, I'll go back tomorrow when it's quieter. He nodded, satisfied, and that was the end of it. I remember standing in the doorway for a moment, watching him arrange our forks and knives into the drawer organizer I'd bought weeks earlier, and feeling something strange settle over me. Not rage, not yet. Just a kind of cold clarity, like stepping outside on the first frost of the year and finally being able to see your own breath. Over the following days, I did something I had never done in 12 years of marriage. I started watching my husband the way you watch a stranger. I noticed things I'd always seen but never truly looked at. Nathan handled every piece of financial paperwork that came through our mailbox, sorting bills and statements with a practiced efficiency I'd once admired, calling it just easier this way whenever I offered to help. I noticed that Margaret, who visited nearly every other day under the guise of helping us settle in, always managed to be the one who collected the mail from the box at the end of the driveway before I even got home from work. I noticed the way their conversation would shift the moment I entered a room, not stopping exactly, but softening, rerouting, like water finding a different path around a rock. None of it, on its own, would have meant anything. Together, it meant everything. 3 days after my visit to Walter Hayes's house, Nathan came home with a folder of documents and laid them on the dining table with the easy, unbothered manner of a man discussing weekend plans. Refinance paperwork. He said, nothing exciting. Just cleaning up some of the loan terms now that we've closed. Routine stuff. Margaret, who happened to be there. She seemed always to happen to be there, reached over and patted my hand. Everyone does this after closing. Dear, it's boring, but it's just paperwork. A few pages. And it's done. I looked at the folder, thick and official, and felt the cold clarity from days earlier harden into something more useful. Ah, Pilan. Of course, I said, smiling. Let me look it over when I have a quiet evening. I like to actually read things before I sign. You know how I am. Nathan's jaw tightened for half a second, so briefly I might have imagined it, if I hadn't been watching so closely. Of course, he said. No rush, but there was a rush. I could feel it in the air between them. In the way Margaret's eyes flicked toward Nathan and back to me. In the slight, practiced patience of two people trying not to seem eager. I asked innocent questions over the following evenings. What does this clause mean? Why is this section highlighted? Is this the standard form the bank uses? And each time, Nathan answered smoothly, confidently, clearly relieved that I wasn't pushing harder. He began to relax. He began, I think, to believe that his mother had been right about me all along, that I was too trusting, too soft, too in love to ever really look. What he didn't know was that every night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a soft blue light, going through every page of that folder, line by line. I photographed each document before returning the folder exactly to where he'd left it. I opened a new email account under a name that meant nothing to anyone but me, and began forwarding copies there. Along with screenshots and dates, I kept a small voice recorder in my cardigan pocket during family dinners, capturing conversations I would later replay in my car during my lunch break. Parked 3 blocks from my office, where no one I knew would see me crying quietly before wiping my face and going back to work like nothing had happened. I built a folder of my own, a shadow archive, invisible to them, growing heavier every day. It was on the 5th night that I found the clause that changed everything. Reading by the small glow of my screen while Nathan slept upstairs, I found it buried on page 14 of the refinance documents, language so dense and technical it seemed designed to be skipped over. A provision granting Nathan limited power of attorney over matters related to the property, to be enacted upon my signature and notarized approval. It was worded carefully, almost elegantly, framed as a convenience, something to streamline future paperwork, so I wouldn't be burdened by routine administrative matters. I read it 3 times to be certain I understood what I was looking at. It wasn't a refinance, or rather, it was a refinance wrapped around something else entirely, a legal key that, once turned, would let Nathan make decisions about my house, my father's money, my future without ever needing to ask me again. I sat very still in the dark kitchen, listening to the old house settle around me. Its unfamiliar creaks still strange to my ears after only a week of living there. I thought about my father, about the quiet, careful way he'd saved his money over 30 years of teaching chemistry to teenagers who mostly didn't care, about the thing he used to tell me that the surest way to lose something valuable wasn't theft. It was trust, handed to the wrong person, without ever checking where it landed. I closed the laptop, and for the first time since that phone call, I allowed myself a small, grim smile in the darkness. They thought I was signing away my future. I was about to make sure I never lost it at all. I found Michael Grant's name the way most people find lawyers when they're afraid to ask anyone they know. A late-night search on my phone in bed. Screen brightness turned all the way down so the light wouldn't wake Nathan beside me. Real estate attorney. 26 years of practice. Reviews that used words like discreet and thorough. I called his office the next morning from the parking lot of the grocery store, my heart pounding as though I were doing something shameful instead of something necessary. Michael Grant's office was small and unglamorous, tucked above a dry cleaner's on a quiet street. and I liked him immediately for exactly that reason. Nothing about him seemed interested in impressing me. Maybe 58. Gray at the temples. The unhurried manner of a man who had seen every version of the story I was about to tell him and had stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. I brought everything: the USB drive, my photographs of the documents, copies of emails, the voice recordings organized by date on my phone. I set it all on his desk like evidence at a trial. Because, in some sense, I suppose that's exactly what it was. He watched the footage first. In silence. His expression unreadable. Occasionally pausing to write something on a legal pad in handwriting too small for me to read upside down. When it ended, he sat back and looked at me for a long moment. "Mrs. Carter, I want to be direct with you, because I think you'd prefer that to gentleness right now. Please. This is not a routine refinance. The power of attorney clause on page 14, if signed and notarized, would give your husband broad authority over decisions related to the property. Not immediate total control, but enough scaffolding that, over time, with a few more carefully worded documents, he could transfer ownership, take out loans against the equity, or sell the property, all without requiring your active participation in each step. It's built to look harmless. It's built to be signed by someone who trusts the person handing it to them and doesn't read past the first paragraph." I felt my hands tighten in my lap. So it's legal. On its face? Yes. That's what makes it dangerous. There's nothing illegal about a spouse asking another spouse to sign paperwork. The law generally assumes that if you signed something, you understood it, which means the only real protection you have is not signing it and making sure they can't quietly force the issue another way. Can they? Not if we move quickly. He tapped his pen against the pad. I can file protective measures today. A notice of interest. Updated deed language. A formal record establishing you as the sole party with authority to approve any transfer or encumbrance on the property. It won't stop them from asking you to sign anything, but it will mean that even if you did sign under pressure, or without fully understanding, any transfer would require your personal, verified appearance, and separate legal counsel review, before it could ever be finalized. He looked at me steadily. In plain terms, I'm building a wall around the house that only you can open. Relief moved through me so suddenly it was almost dizzying. But underneath it sat something harder. Something that had been growing since the night I first read that clause by the glow of my laptop. I want more than a wall. "Mr. Grant," I said, "I want them to understand exactly what they tried to do. I want it documented. I want it undeniable." He studied me for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Exactly. A kind of quiet respect. "Then we do this carefully," he said. "You continue exactly as you have been. Don't refuse to sign. Don't confront them. Let them believe they're close to finishing what they started. The more comfortable they become, the more they'll say, and the more they say, the stronger your position becomes." I left his office that afternoon with copies of my own carbon, copies of every filing he'd promised to submit that week, and I drove home rehearsing quietly the version of myself I needed to keep performing. Grateful wife. Trusting wife. A woman slowly, sweetly coming around to signing away a life she didn't yet know was already legally armored against them. It worked better than I expected. Within 2 days, Nathan's demeanor had shifted from cautious to comfortable. The tightness I'd noticed around his jaw during our first conversation about the paperwork was now entirely gone. He began speaking more openly at dinner, mentioning offhand that maybe once things were settled, he'd finally get quotes for that home office he'd always wanted in the basement. Margaret, sensing victory, the way she seemed to sense everything, began arriving with paint swatches and furniture catalogs, holding them up against my walls with the proprietary confidence of a woman decorating a house she already considered hers. I watched them build their comfort like a house of cards, one relaxed conversation at a time. and I said nothing to disturb it. On a Thursday evening, Margaret mentioned, almost casually, that she knew a notary who could come by the house directly. So much easier than driving somewhere. Dear, especially with how busy you've been. I let a beat of hesitation pass, the kind a woman might show when finally letting go of something she'd been holding too tightly, and then I smiled. Monday. I said, let's do Monday. I'll have the whole weekend to feel settled about it. Margaret's face lit with something close to triumph. Nathan reached over and squeezed my hand. And I let him. I smiled back at him with an ease that would have terrified me a week earlier. Because I understood now, watching his relieved, satisfied face, that I was no longer the woman standing in the way of his plan. I was the woman closing the trap around it. The days between Thursday and Monday passed strangely stretched thin by a tension only I seemed to feel. In the house, everything looked like happiness. Nathan hummed while he made coffee in the mornings. Margaret arrived nearly every afternoon now, tape measure in hand, murmuring about where a sectional might go once we opened up this space a little, as though the walls themselves already belonged to a future she'd already decided on. I let them talk. I let them plan. I poured coffee and nodded at fabric swatches and asked polite questions about square footage. And underneath all of it, I kept my phone recording in my cardigan pocket, kept my eyes open, kept building the case that Michael Grant would later call, with quiet, professional understatement, one of the more thorough evidentiary files I've seen from a client who wasn't a lawyer herself. On Friday evening, Nathan started talking about renovations with an openness he'd never shown before we married. He wanted to knock down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room. He wanted a home office in the basement, maybe a wet bar, for entertaining his college friends, the ones who still called him by the nickname he'd had at 22. He talked about all of it with the loose, easy confidence of a man discussing a house he no longer thought of as jointly owned. Just his, with me as a pleasant, cooperative presence somewhere in the background of his plans. We could even look at getting a place upstate eventually, he said, refilling his wine glass. Once things are more flexible financially. Flexible, how I asked, keeping my voice light. Curious. The voice of a woman who still believed she was simply along for the ride. Oh, you know, once the paperwork's finalized, there's more room to make moves. Refinance again down the line. Maybe pull some equity for investments. Nothing to worry about. He smiled at me over his glass, and I smiled back. And I thought about Walter Hayes's camera behind the bookshelf, still capturing everything. Still quietly telling the truth. Even when no one in the room wanted it heard, Saturday brought Margaret in full force. Moving through my kitchen with a confidence that had stopped bothering to disguise itself as guest-like politeness. She opened the pantry and rearranged 2 shelves for better flow. She stood in the center of the living room, hands on her hips, and told Nathan that the fireplace mantle would need to be replaced. Something with real character, not this builder-grade nonsense. The way you'd speak about a house you already owned outright, not one still legally standing in another woman's name. It was Sunday evening, the night before the scheduled signing, that gave me the piece of evidence I hadn't even known I was still missing. Nathan found me in the kitchen washing the last of the dinner dishes, and he came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist in a gesture so familiar, so achingly ordinary, that for one unguarded moment, I nearly forgot everything I knew about him. He kissed the side of my head and murmured, low and warm, thinking he was speaking only to me, thinking he was speaking to a woman who trusted him completely. Once everything's transferred, he said, you won't even have to think about any of this again. You'll just wake up one day, and it'll all be handled. You won't even realize how it happened. That's the whole point. I want to protect you from having to deal with all this stress. I kept my hands moving in the soapy water, kept my breathing even, and somewhere in my cardigan pocket, the small recorder captured every word. That sounds nice, I said, and I meant it to sound soft, Grateful. The voice of a woman being cared for. Only I knew what those words actually were, a full, unguarded confession. Spoken by a man so certain of his victory that he no longer felt any need for caution. Monday morning. I met Michael Grant one final time before work. In the parking lot of a coffee shop 3 towns away from anywhere either of us was known. He confirmed that every filing was complete, the notice of interest recorded, the deed protections in place, the documentation package assembled and ready to be presented the moment it was needed. He looked at me with the same quiet respect he'd shown since our first meeting. "Are you ready for this evening?" "I've been ready," I said, since the day I watched that video. That evening, I came home and found Nathan setting the dining table with unusual care. The good plates, the candles we'd received as a wedding gift and never once used, a bottle of wine he'd clearly chosen for the occasion. Margaret arrived shortly after, dressed as though for a small celebration, her smile wide and satisfied. A little dinner before the signing. Nathan said, pulling out my chair for me, "We thought you deserved something nice, given everything you've been so understanding about." I sat down at the table my father's money had helped build, across from the 2 people who had spent weeks quietly planning to take it from me. And I smiled, and I picked up my glass when Nathan raised his in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes warm, his voice full of a happiness I once would have given anything to earn. "To new beginnings," I echoed, and I meant something entirely different by it than he did. Margaret smiled at us both, radiant, already decorating a house that would never truly be hers. Neither of them noticed the way I kept glancing toward the front door, waiting, counting the minutes, knowing that somewhere on the road toward our house, a car was already on its way carrying a man who would arrive before dinner ended and change everything they thought they had already won. Dinner unfolded exactly the way Nathan had planned it. Candlelight flickering against the good china. Wine poured a little too generously. Margaret telling a long story about Nathan's childhood meant, I think, to remind me how deeply he belonged to this family and how naturally I should want to belong to it too. I laughed in the right places. I asked the right questions. I ate very little, because my stomach had been tight with anticipation since that morning. But no one seemed to notice. They were too absorbed in their own quiet celebration to look closely at me. When the plates were cleared, Nathan reached into the sideboard drawer and pulled out the folder, setting it on the table between us with a gentleness that almost looked like reverence. He opened it to the final page, smoothed it flat with his palm, and slid a pen across the tablecloth toward me. "No rush," he said, though his eyes said otherwise. "Whenever you're ready." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her wineglass forgotten in her hand, watching the pen the way a person watches the last few seconds before a firework goes off. I picked it up. I let my fingers rest against it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, feeling the weight of everything the last 2 weeks had asked of me, the silence I'd had to keep, the smiles I'd had to fake, the nights I'd spent awake with a phone recorder in my pocket and a heart full of grief for the marriage I'd thought I had. I lowered the pen toward the signature line. The doorbell rang. Nathan's head snapped up, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "We're not expecting anyone," he said, more to himself than to me, and he glanced at his mother, who shook her head slightly, equally confused. "I'll get it," I said, and I set the pen down without signing a single letter. I opened the door to find Michael Grant, standing on the porch in a gray suit, calm and unhurried, a leather folder tucked under his arm. Behind him, a step back, stood a uniformed court officer holding a small stack of documents. "Good evening, Mrs. Carter," Michael said, his voice pitched perfectly for the moment, professional, unbothered, utterly without drama, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd shouted, "I believe this is a good time." I stepped aside and let them in. Nathan rose from the table so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "What is this?" His eyes moved from Michael to the officer to me, and I watched something behind them begin to shift. The first tremor of a man realizing the ground beneath him was no longer solid. "Emily, what's going on?" I didn't answer right away. I walked back to my seat at the head of the table and sat down, folding my hands in front of me the way I had learned to do in Michael's office. Calm. Deliberate. A woman fully in possession of herself. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," Michael said, addressing Nathan and Margaret both. "I'm here on behalf of my client, Emily Carter, to formally notify you that the property at this address has been legally protected against unauthorized transfer, refinancing, or encumbrance. Any documents requiring her signature for such purposes are void as of today, and any future attempt to alter ownership status will require independent legal review and her verified unpressured consent." The court officer stepped forward and placed the documents on the table beside the folder Nathan had so carefully prepared in almost absurd symmetry. One stack representing the future they'd planned, the other quietly dismantling it. Margaret's face had gone pale. Her earlier warmth entirely drained away, replaced by something colder. Sharper the calculation she usually kept so carefully hidden, now fully visible. "This is absurd," she said. "This is our family's home. Nathan has every right. Nathan has whatever rights are granted to him under the law, and under any agreement Emily willingly and knowingly enters into." Michael said evenly, "Neither applies here." Then he reached into his leather folder and sat down. On Ebi-1. The evidence I had spent 2 weeks gathering in silence. Printed transcripts of the security footage from Walter Hayes's camera, screenshots of the refinance documents. Page 14 circled in red. Copies of emails between Margaret and the mortgage broker she'd contacted without my knowledge. And finally, a small device, the voice recorder, which Michael pressed play on, filling the dining room with the sound of Nathan's own voice from the night before, warm and unguarded, saying words he never imagined would be replayed in front of a court officer at his own dinner table. "Once everything's transferred, you won't even have to think about any of this again. You won't even realize how it happened." Nathan's face drained of color. Margaret sat frozen, staring at the recorder as though it were something that had betrayed her personally. "How long have you known?" Nathan asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence, almost pleading. I looked at him, really looked, the way I hadn't allowed myself to since that first phone call, searching one last time for some trace of the man I had married, the one who held my hand at my father's funeral, the one I had trusted with everything I had left in the world. "Long enough," I said. The words hung in the room, simple and final, and I watched something in Nathan's expression finally break. Not surprise, not even anger, just the slow, sinking understanding of a man who had spent weeks so certain of his own success that he never once considered the woman across the table might be watching him just as carefully as he'd been watching her. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her eyes moving over the documents on the table with the desperate calculation of someone searching for an exit that no longer existed. The candles were still burning. The wine was still half full in our glasses, and somewhere beneath the ruins of the celebration Nathan had planned so carefully, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph, exactly, but a quiet, settling certainty that whatever came next, I would face it standing on ground that was finally, undeniably, my own. They left within the hour. Nathan packed 2 suitcases in near silence. Margaret waited by the front door, arms crossed, refusing to look at me. Just before she stepped outside, she turned and said, in a voice stripped of all its earlier warmth, "You'll regret this. Family is family. Emily, you'll learn that the hard way alone in this house. I already have a family. I said, the one my father built for me, and this house is part of what he left me, not something I'm willing to hand over to protect people who were never protecting me back. She didn't respond. The door closed behind them both, and the sound of it quiet. Final. Ordinary was somehow louder than anything that had happened all evening. I stood alone in the front hallway for a long time after they'd gone, listening to the house settle around me the same way it had that first strange night. With Walter Hayes's USB drive sitting heavy in my coat pocket, it didn't feel like the house had changed. It felt like I finally understood what had been true about it all along. That it was mine. Fully. Completely. In a way it had never quite felt before that phone call. Before that video. Before I learned exactly what I was capable of. When everything I loved was threatened. I think about it often now. How close I came to signing away everything my father worked his whole life to give me, simply because I trusted the wrong smile at the wrong table. Real love doesn't need to be protected through secrecy. Through paperwork slipped quietly past someone who trusts you too much to read the fine print. The truest kind of partnership is built in the open. I still live in that house. I've put in the tomato garden I always planned. And some mornings, I sit on the porch with my coffee, and I think about how easily I could have lost it all. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe, because we have so many more like it to share with you.